Hello and welcome to Terrain Oddity. My name is Jay and this is the first proper Terrain Talk Tuesday. Oh, my voice went a little bit weird as I finished that. Terrain Talk Tuesday. It's very hot in the UK, so apologise if I'm visibly sweating or melting. But there you have it. What we're going to talk about today is how important should terrain be in a war game? Now you might think that's a simple question. Lots. Obvious. It should be super important. But a lot of people don't really see that, and they see terrain as an obstacle. Obviously, part of my job here on this channel is to try and make terrain less of an obstacle for people. And there's, you can always buy terrain, so it's maybe just a financial obstacle. But, I'm talking about like game mechanics and that kind of thing. How important should the rules be? And do we require 3D terrain, or is 2D terrain fine? Before we talk about all of this, if at the end of this video you like the video, do press like. And if you're not subscribed and you're interested in terrain, either just talking about terrain or obviously seeing tutorials, that's what I'm trying to do here, so I would really appreciate it if you did subscribe. So yeah, why am I even talking about this? So, well, one, I'm doing Terrain Talk Tuesday and I need a subject. I mean, duh. Sorry, to do Billie Eilish there, I'll take that back. Yeah, I played Warcry the other day, and obviously my main game is Star Wars Legion. And I was thinking about how they approach terrain. And I won't go into too much detail, but in Warcry, terrain is essentially just a vertical move. It, like, if you want to climb up 4 inches, it's 4 inches. That's it, right? Whereas in Star Wars Legion, generally, as long as it's not like a barricade which you just sort of go slowly over, it's like a 4-inch wall or something, you've got to climb or clamber, which basically means you've got to spend a minimum of 1 action, most likely 2, unless you have like equipment like grappling hook, something like that. You normally have to spend actions to get up and down. And I was like, oh, this changes the way that the game approaches terrain. Not just in the sense of like, should it 2D terrain, etc. How people buying it, what have you. It literally physically impacts it changes the impact of the terrain in the game. So for Legion, terrain gain up and down becomes a lot more important and slow and considered. But then what's the benefit? Well, you're likely going to be in heavy cover from almost everybody. You're going to have better line of sight. It makes sense, right? And for Warcry, it sort of just feels like an easy obstacle to get around, but maybe you can use it to block people's movement and to hide from combat or getting shot or what have you. It's simple, but what that allowed them to do in Warcry, there's rules for, and a little bit like Kill Team, for those of you familiar with Kill Team, it's just Warcry's in my head. There's falling damage. You can literally, if you get shot, if you get critically hit in Warcry whilst you're within half an inch of a ledge, you have a chance of falling off, bump, and taking damage, which is fine, right? Great. The advantage to going up is all that movement, etc. And you are likely to get like a +1 toughness to your like defensive roll in Warcry if you are elevated. Not only is there just falling damage, there's like dangerous terrain. Like if you fall onto some spikes, it's more likely to do damage. Like you do more damage. It's like, oh, that's cool. And that's sort of all it is. It's cool. It's good for gameplay and movement, but it's cool. Whereas in Legion, as I said, you get this heavy cover, and there's a counterpoint. Oh, by the way, there's a weapon in the core set in Warcry where if you shoot it on somebody, you can then move them. It's like a jump, so they like jump off stuff, and you can like jump between ledges, and they'll take damage, I think. In Legion, there was a rule where Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, you can do force pushes, but the developers basically said, we're not going to allow you to force push people off buildings or ledges because, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it punished you for getting elevated. And they were like, we want people to interact with the terrain. If we make the terrain something that's like more of a disadvantage than it is an advantage, then people won't necessarily use it. And I was like, this makes sense. So you've got to balance this sort of like realism with practicality as well. I think like Legion goes for sort of like a more realistic way. Obviously you have Luke Skywalker just jumping on buildings, so it's not like super realistic, but it's relatively more realistic. You've got to get to the wall and climb the wall and spend your actions and spend your time doing it. Fine. Warcry, it's just like, I'm just gonna like essentially walk up it. Right? And I think that's when it comes to terrain in a game, that's sort of how it can all boil down into practicality versus realistic. Right, and sort of combinations of the two. How much of an impact do we want it? Do we want it so like if how much like damage does it mitigate, how much movement does it mitigate, and it probably changes game to game. So like a proper historical Flames of War, no idea about Flames of War, I've never played it by the way, but let's just say Flames of War, historical World War II one game, whatever it is. How does the terrain impact? Well, it might be a little bit more realistic in that game because that's the setting sort of not forces it upon you, but it sort of wants it to be like that. Whereas Warcry or a fantasy game, it's just whatever's easiest, isn't it? Basically, let's make it so the game's speedy, quick, etc. And that's sort of the kind of point. Though, like practicality is generally like time. And also one thing that, like, after you've done all that, the game developer decides how much terrain should have an impact. There's also that second consideration of like, how are they going to get this terrain? Like on a 40k board, 6x4, if terrain's line of sight blocking terrain's apparently super important. Yet Games Workshop only really sell like their own plastic kits, and it's not necessarily the cheapest way of getting terrain. But are they making the game partly to sell the terrain, or if you're another game company who's making models that doesn't sell terrain, should you just be like, oh, well, we need terrain in this game, so what we're actually going to have to do is put in the 2D terrain? I think like Simon Games, cool mini or not, they do, I think in Song of Ice and Fire, I think it's 2D terrain mostly. And doing 2D terrain sort of makes sense when you consider that, as I said, companies aren't going to sell them, and practically wise, 2D terrain is probably the easiest to use. If you're not getting any vertical terrain on the board, then 2D terrain sort of makes the most sense, right? Instead of having a pond or a river, I'll just have a flat bit of terrain and then we'll play it like it is real. However, the people among you who are probably on this channel, and myself of course, I like to see proper full terrain on the board. And I understand that games probably will sell it with like 2D terrain, like War Machine. I think they had like a 2D terrain like system. I think I prefer the visual aspect of terrain. So, like, how much of an impact should it have? I think enough that means that people should want physical terrain. But I think maybe also enough that if people really didn't want to and just wanted to play with, like, placeholders for terrain, that could also be possible. Now, something like Legion is really, you probably need terrain because you're going to have people being blocked and that kind of thing. Your game would just not look as visually pleasing as if you had the terrain. And it's sort of the same for Warcry. You need to be able to have that movement blocking stuff there. It's got janky angles and all that kind of stuff. Like, the terrain is pretty important. And I think generally that's the way most games should be, unless it's like X-Wing, like the asteroid you just place down. Obviously, like, you don't really need to have a lot of terrain there. But I think most games should sort of be somewhat dependent on the terrain. And I don't think that's a problem. There's generally easy-ish ways to do sort of cheap terrain, so I don't really have a problem with that. And a lot of people are playing in stores that just provide terrain, so that's also okay. I just think it's interesting to consider the impact of the terrain on the rule set. And something like, as I said, Legion versus Warcry just sort of really like sprung to my head. It's like, yeah, it makes perfect sense that if it's more difficult to get onto the terrain and it provides you a good benefit, then having easy ways to get people off that terrain are going to then reduce the desire to get onto the terrain in the first place. But it also makes sense that slightly slows down the game in some elements, whereas Warcry is like, well, we need it for this and this, but we're not necessarily bothered about, we don't want to spend too long being like, well, you've got to move to that and then climb up. It's just a case of, you just run up it, basically. And I'm just curious if, like, are there any games that have really taken this concept beyond this? Are there any where it's like, apart from like X-Wing, are there any games that are like, terrain's not really that relevant? Blood Bowl would probably be an example of that. Things with like cells. I think games like Super Fantasy Brawl, terrain's not really relevant because it's literally hexagons, and those hexagons, it's a small playing area. I'm not sure if there's any like free-form skirmish game like Warcry Vanguard, that kind of stuff, where terrain is completely almost irrelevant. I doubt it. Let me know if there is. And then is there any game where like the kind of terrain is imperative? So it really matters that maybe the difference between tall grass or a muddy, rocky field. Is there any game where the like subtle differences in the kind of terrain makes a massive impact on the game. Like, I'd be very intrigued. I sort of suspect the more historical games might be like that, but I'd very much be curious if you would let me know in the comments below. So what do you think? How important do you think terrain should be in a game? Obviously, if you're here, you might enjoy terrain, I suspect, and you might enjoy that visual style. But I always think, just because we enjoy it, should we be a bit more concerned about people who aren't really that bothered about terrain, who just want to get playing? Should the 2D terrain be welcomed? Should I even make some 2D terrain? Not sure I even could, but I guess it's an open question. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As ever though, have a most beautiful day, and goodbye.